I think maybe I should sit here because I got to see the,
Okay.
know when to kick you off.
Sit round there.
Woo, that's a real fire.
We need marshmallows.
Yeah, where are the s'mores? Do they do that in Finland? Do we know?
To be determined tonight.
Well, welcome. Thanks for coming today, Tom.
Thank you.
And it's a pleasure to be here and see this amazingly huge conference happening. So congratulations to the organizers. As you heard, I'm Chris O'Brien with VentureBeat. We have Tom Hulme from Google Ventures. And Tom, just to sort of get this conversation started, I mean, I arrived from Silicon Valley in Europe 2 years ago, and you always have to be a little careful when you're the new guy in town because everything seems new and exciting and it's all being discovered by you. But I think I've been here long enough to get a sense that in general in Europe, there's been a big shift, entrepreneurially speaking, in terms of the momentum in startups, the amount of venture capital, all the metrics that you would look at. I mean, is that your view from where you sit as well and from Google Ventures' view?
Absolutely. We're bullish about technology in Europe because of a few forces. The first is, and everyone in this conference knows, technology is available. We can scale faster than ever before with off-the-shelf products, including machine learning. Secondly, entrepreneurship is now a valid career. Previously, the best students would dream of a 50-year career in a big company and receive a carriage clock at the end of it. And partly because of the financial crisis, I think that seemed less appealing to all of us. And finally, more recently, some of the economic turmoil has lowered the other opportunities. Like, it's made it, innovation, scarcity breeds innovation. I think that's something we've seen in Europe. Some of the southern European countries where we suddenly have a thriving startup scene like Barcelona, Lisbon, that's partly a function of unemployment.
Yeah. So I want to come back to all that, but let's start with you guys, because in that thinking of just even my time here, it created kind of a big splash and a sort of seen it as a validation point of that idea when Google Ventures officially announced it would be in Europe. And I think that was 2 or 3 years ago now.
2.5 years ago.
Now you guys have evolved your approach, and then that's caused a sort of debate about, is Google Ventures still interested in Europe? Are they not? What are they doing here? Can you talk a little bit about how your approach here has evolved and what you are doing now in terms of how you look at Europe?
Yeah, I'd love to. So we started, we built a footprint for Google Ventures in Europe 2.5 years ago, and we just had a hypothesis, and that was an approach similar to that which we have in the US would apply here. In the US, we built a pretty good brand, I think. We've still got work to do, but we invest roughly $300 million a year now. In 2009, when the firm started, it was only $50 million a year. And we looked at the European ecosystem, all the stuff that I just described, and thought perhaps there's room for us to invest and then also add value. And so that's the hypothesis that we tested, and we launched a standalone fund 2.5 years ago, $100 million. And it's been great. We've done 11 investments in Europe so far, which is more than we expected. And interestingly, of 7 deals that I've done personally, the US team of GV have co-invested in more than half. So it was great validation that not only were there interesting stuff for us to invest in, but also that our US partners were excited about the opportunity too. And so at the tail end of last year, we made the decision to put the 2 funds together. So now we have a bigger pool of capital. This year it'll be about $450 million. We have that bigger pool of capital to put to work in high growth stuff in either North America or Europe.
Yeah. And practically speaking, I mean, I know you can't say everything about it, but then in terms of the way you're thinking about your investment, like, do you think less geographically now in terms of where you're looking, or are you, there's certain people like yourself, for instance, you're the Europe guy, or you're specifically looking at certain countries?
Yeah, so we tend to, in truth, and this is true for most VCs, and something for you guys to consider when you're considering your VC, is it's very difficult to add value to a business if you're an 8-hour time difference away. When there's a challenge that the founder wants to discuss, you can be too far away sometimes. So I have a strong preference, and all of my deals bar one have been in Europe, and I would expect to continue to do that. Yeah. When we're making the decision about what investments to make, then we're borderless, because I don't want to invest in the best company in Europe, or indeed the best company in Europe if I think there's a better company globally. These borders are sort of dissolving away. Technology doesn't respect them in the way that certainly immigration does. And on that basis, we don't constrain ourselves when looking for the best in any market by geography.
Yeah. And then along that lines, you sort of mentioned this at the beginning also, but as things over here have developed, there's obviously the startup hubs that people would recognize globally, like a Paris, London, of course, Berlin. But we've seen all these other secondary or third, tertiary ecosystems, however we want to call them, start to develop. We were in Lisbon a couple weeks ago for Web Summit. There's a lot of incredible things happening there. I mean, I'm constantly amazed in my time here. I've been to Bulgaria, which I never would have thought to go to in a million years. There's a really interesting tech ecosystem there. I'm going to go to Estonia after this for a couple of days. Right. What do you, is that, in terms of thinking why that's happening, like, is this a good thing for Europe that there's so many of these regional and national governments are really trying to push themselves? And is there a real opportunity for them? I mean, can Lisbon, can an Estonia or Bulgaria compete against Berlin, London, Paris for startup tech?
I believe so, but I'd say the first point to make is I don't agree with the sort of often the press argument that is this the next Silicon Valley? Because if all we do is fixate on how to make European capitals Silicon Valley, we'll just create inferior versions of Silicon Valley. So instead, I think it's more interesting to say, what are Europe's unfair advantages? And there's some kind of obvious ones, like clearly, the cost of living we talked about earlier is an important one. There's great technical talent in Europe, like France, where you live, has more Fields medals, which is like the mathematics Nobel Prize per capita, than anywhere else. I mean, technically, it's a phenomenal, like mathematicians, physicists, a phenomenal country. And so there's some unfair advantages there. And I think the best ecosystems try and be great at something rather than trying to be okay at everything. And I don't think just low cost of living is enough. Instead, you want to see a kind of thin end of the wedge. What's the thing that's going to get the ecosystem going and then it'll spill over? So we're in Helsinki. I would put the Nordics as probably the best ecosystem for building games globally at the moment. And that's because you get this multiplier effects. You get founders that come out and reinvest their cash in startups. But perhaps even more excitingly, now there's a bunch of people in this region that have been managers in fast-growing, big, successful companies. And certainly, 10 years ago when I started angel investing, that wasn't true. We'd have great success in the early stage because of a great founder, but then we'd hit a wall because there weren't experienced people to hire to build a big business. And often those companies had to sell early.
Yeah, I mean, where I live in Toulouse, I mean, there's also, again, a really interesting, fast-growing, small startup scene. But people ask me all the time, like, well, should we stay in Toulouse? Should we try to do it here? And then at a certain point, when you get to 100 people, it's going to be tough to find a director of marketing who has global experience with consumer to whatever business that you're in. And you probably have to think about going elsewhere to find that person, maybe somewhere else in Europe, maybe somewhere else in the United States or wherever.
Exactly. And there's a couple of things we see on that. So we're seeing sort of regional specialization a bit. So, for example, a great Parisian startup will often put sales and marketing on the West Coast now as a sort of beachhead to get there, and it feels US-centric to potential customers there. But then they might also put performance marketing in Israel, which is a phenomenal place for it because of the gaming industry and all of that stuff. So I think these distributed teams are going to become more likely rather than less likely. And while running a distributed team is very tough for a startup. It kind of erodes social capital.
Yeah.
In larger companies, actually, it's probably the only way to do it.
Yeah. So what areas are you guys now sort of looking at in Europe or really anywhere in terms of your portfolio and, I mean, to the I guess the official topic of this session, like looking for innovation. How are you guys going about that? Are there certain category subjects that you've defined that you said this is only where we're looking for opportunity right now?
So look, it's like everyone's lives in here. It's a combination of being reactive to stuff and where you can in those little gaps being proactive.
Yeah.
And in truth, we don't devote as much time as I would love to being proactive. But the areas that we've been proactive in the last 12 months, in fact, since Slush this time last year, have mainly been genomics and AI. So we took a view early on that Europe has some unfair advantages in both. There's some around the regulation in genomics. There's definitely some around the talent in both genomics and AI. The fact that we often have kind of national health systems is helpful to get some of the data, the longitudinal data, electronic medical records, which will be increasingly important for some genomics businesses. And so we had that proactive point of view, and we've done 3 genomics investments since Slush last year in Europe. AI, we had a similar point of view, and North London is emerging as a real hotspot for AI with, there's a great Facebook team under Jan LeCun based in Paris.
Yeah.
You've got DeepMind based in King's Cross. And so we're starting to see that evolve. And so those are a couple of areas we've been proactive in. We're also actively looking at the stuff you would expect at the moment. So drones, self-driving cars. I think there's an interesting argument that self-driving aeroplanes are going to come before self-driving cars, just because it's actually an easier technical problem in a weird way. So there's a few other areas we're looking at.
I mean, planes are sort of self-driving, right? I mean...
Yeah, they are, exactly. Yeah. But the vertical takeoff craft, so the idea of if you were running a large taxi company at the moment, there's an argument in a city like Sao Paulo that it would be easier to do a self-flying vehicle startup than a self-driving car startup.
I don't know if that terrifies me or...
That's your call. There's definitely, interestingly, one of the common topics, and it's a topic here, is all of the technology that we're all working on has the potential to be used for great good or great evil's too strong a word, but used negligently. And so, to me, technology's just a tool, but increasingly, I'm coming to realize that technology is never neutral. Yeah. And so we have to be thoughtful about how it's applied.
But, it's interesting because, almost inherently, and this is one of the things I've always appreciated about being involved in various ways in this industry, it's one that's generally full of optimism about the future. And it does feel like, for various reasons over the past month or 6 months, that there's a lot more, at least, questions and negativity surrounding, or people really debating the things that we're doing. Like, are they making the world a better place? Are they? Have we been too naive in believing a kind of utopian future is inevitable if we just keep pushing in this direction? And there's certainly stuff like medtech and AI have enormous implications that are obvious in terms of helping diagnosis and helping make that system better, but there's the fear part of it too. I mean, do you feel a shift in general, and what is the implication for that in terms of just the way people are embracing this stuff?
It's a really good question, and not one that I have a great answer to, but I certainly more than ever before am mindful about what we do in the tech industry. And if one good thing can come out of the political turmoil in the last 6 months, I hope that it's us in our various filter bubbles, our social bubbles, will look beyond them again and try and understand, be open-minded to other people's perspectives. And perhaps over time, we've seen an empathy gap grow, where we've lost empathy for people that historically we would have bumped into more often because we've been able to just kind of move ourselves into these bubbles of like-minded people. So certainly the thing that I've been trying to do more recently is to kind of fill that empathy gap, and where I can start to follow people with differing opinions on things like Twitter, just to understand some of the alternative arguments around the stuff, the decisions we all collectively make.
But, then if you're thinking about disrupting things, generally speaking, I mean, this is a gross oversimplification, but generally speaking, like my time in Silicon Valley is that they were all kind of cheerleaders for disruption. Like, disruption is good on the face of it because, breaking things apart will be the way to get to a better future. I mean, do we need to be doing more to consider the consequences of?
Yeah, I think we need to. The changes are happening faster than ever. So technological change and progress has always happened. The agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution were really interesting examples of that. The difference is this is now happening, instead of over decades, it's happening in less than 10 years. And so I think the pain, the wrenching to society is bigger than, it feels bigger than it has been historically. And so we have to all, in the moment, think about that. But, Schumpeter described capitalism as creative destruction. There's always been the sort of creation from the destruction. And I think we all, and I noticed this really in the last few months after the political, the recent events, I think we're all starting to consider what the destruction bit means and how we can help people through that.
Yeah. But, then it's tricky to think about because I've spent a lot of time trying to puzzle together sort of the economic future, for instance, of connected cars and autonomous cars. And it's very hard, even talking to economists around a concept like that, to really find people who feel like they really you can fully look down the road and see, here's the economic implications of, say, like Uber going to all autonomous cars. Is that going to create jobs? Is that going to make the economy better? How does that create
tough.
Winners and losers? Like, it's a very difficult thing to really drill into and feel confident that
Correct.
how these things are going to play out.
Because you can't, it's tough to build the balance sheet of the pros and the cons and then quantify each side, because there's the first order effects, like reduction in number of drivers, but then there's the second order effects, like increased time for people to be doing other entrepreneurial stuff that we'll never be able to see. So what's encouraging is people are actually talking through the pros and the cons and imagining what they might do if they increase tensions.
Yeah. But then, and you're kind of putting your official hat on, you're sitting down with portfolio companies, you're looking for the big innovations, the things that are both going to have a big societal impact, but then obviously, hopefully, generate big returns. That's officially the goal on a certain level.
That's our
job. Do you feel like that part of that role is to sit down and say, okay, yes, here's the business, here's the technology. Is it a good thing to be doing? Do you have sort of permission to do that?
Yeah, we do. And actually, the gentleman that founded GV, a guy called Bill Maris, who's left the firm since, but David Crane since, and all of my other general partners, we almost always have the conversation around whether we think that the businesses we invest in are net positive to the world. And in truth, I actually think that it's not just being a better citizen, it will actually deliver better returns. Because in a market where the feedback loop is so fast and brands are created or destroyed almost overnight, being a decent citizen is just, understanding your stakeholders and maximizing that. So we don't per se have a sort of scorecard on social impact, but it's absolutely right in the heart of our decision-making process.
And do you find that then, people you're working with are open to that conversation, or are they sort of like, whatever?
I think they're open to it. And I think they're open to it because the best entrepreneurs have a long vision. We don't back people that want to build a business in 6 months and sell it. That's not interesting to us. In truth, we're actually looking for the investments that will take a lot longer to build because it differentiates us. So it moves us away from traditional venture capital. Yeah. And so we're looking for the people with a long time horizon. And I struggle to imagine a great founder that doesn't recognize this is going to become more important, and therefore in the time horizons of his business, he or her business, they need a point of view.
Yeah.
And so I think the best founders, it's often the reason they get going. It's what gives them the extra energy. They fundamentally believe what they're doing is important, but they certainly think about the effect over time.
Yeah. You know, we were talking before about how Europe is developing its startup ecosystem, and one of the things that's interesting to me, coming from the Valley, which is very, very much of the mind that, you know, you got to do it on your own, you know, you succeed or fail on your own. Generally speaking, not true everywhere, but generally speaking, governments here have opted to play a larger role in trying to catalyze startup ecosystems. French Tech, of course, is a famous example. Again, down in Lisbon, the Portugal government announced a bunch of initiatives, a fund to co-invest with people. We see that across Europe. And it's intriguing to me because, again, it's a very different, I see it sort of as an experiment at the moment. Like, they're all kind of 5 or 6 years into this, so we'll see if it works. But it's a very different sort of economic thesis than the one you would find in Silicon Valley. And at the same time, they're very clear when they're stating the reasons for doing this. They're not just looking for tech successes for the sake of having the buzz or the hype. No, they really feel like France, the one I'm most familiar with, I mean, they're very focused on saying, we want this to happen, but we want to make sure it's benefiting everybody economically across the country, which is not something you would hear, generally speaking, in Silicon Valley. I mean, is it naive, and how do you, from the European perspective, and how do you see that do you see it as a positive or a negative for these ecosystems that the governments have been more aggressive in trying to support them?
Yeah, so net, I see it as a positive. So I was lucky enough to help Number 10 in London, so the government think through Tech City and get going. And one of the things that the advisors to David Cameron did a great job of is they realized sometimes government's job is just to get out the way. You kind of want to create the conditions for this stuff to happen, and there's some things that I think are absolutely essential. So one would be diversity of talent. Another would be access to early stage capital. So there's those sorts of things the government can influence a little, and then they create a petri dish that great founders will sort of grow great businesses on, and often then their job is to get out the way. So I don't believe in a lot of intervention. I believe in setting up that petri dish and then letting it blossom. But I think, for example, the French government, Axel Lemaire, does an amazing, has a great point of view on this. I think she recognizes that if you have great startups, some of this benefit and this wealth will spill over into the broader economy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting then. I understand the logic of a lot of these things. At the same time, I wonder, like, when I see incubators being set up at small rural towns, government supported, I wonder, okay, does that make sense? I mean, is there really the tech startup talent to be investing this money in these small areas? But
it's interesting. Like, I do worry about certain, like, there's been this explosion of very early stage incubators,
yes,
where the barrier to becoming a mentor there or an advisor is basically non-existent. So people just sign up and be advisors. And so I think all of us have a job to, where we can kind of just, improve the quality of the advice, because you get some amazing kind of young people starting businesses, 18, 19, 20, and in truth, they could go to the right place for them rather than just staying at the local accelerator. And we have to kind of shine a light on the best examples to up the general quality.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that I do appreciate what I see now happening in Europe is that more and more, you were talking about the sort of upper management perspective, but it feels like a lot of these people on the scene have kind of been there and done it before, versus there's definitely that level of people that sometimes when you're meeting people talking about this stuff, you feel like, okay, they probably watched some good TED videos on disruption and read a few good blog posts, and now they're mentors or But generally speaking, there seems to be more experienced people who have been through this path one or more times. And I remember, I was impressed talking with folks at Cisco. Like that was part of the reason they said, we want to put more money into Europe, because now we feel like we're on the second or third generation of these people doing this stuff, and we're confident that they can shepherd these companies into later stages.
I found it like building, so on 2 occasions I built companies to over 50 people, and the first 15 or 20 people was easy. But when you get to 25 people, you move from an organization where everyone knows what everyone else is doing, and the CEO can kind of intervene or be aware of it without being a bottleneck, to an organization that's based on trust.
Yeah.
And I had no clue how to do that. And in truth, I didn't know where to look to find advisors that had done it. Yeah. Because you needed people that had been through the growing pains, the high growth trajectory. I didn't want people that had just been in 5,000 people companies, because to my mind, they were bureaucrats. Right. I didn't want people that had built a 5-person startup because they'd never felt the pain. I wanted people that had had those growing pains. And certainly I struggled to find those people. I now think there's a lot of those people in Europe.
Yeah. Okay, let's stop there. I think I'm just about cooked, and I think we're out of time. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Tom.
Thank you.